Hello YouTube friends, Dr. Teresa here again. Just want to talk through a little bit about my newest setup and my decision to move forward with the larger seahorses versus the tragedy with the dwarf seahorses. So I didn't want to give up. I felt like things were going really well until I had that weird situation that caused me to lose the dwarfs. And my husband is a photographer, and he actually appreciates working with the larger seahorses because they're so much easier to photograph. In addition, we have kept seahorses before, both dwarves and the larger species. So we've had experience, but it's been a lot of years. So I kind of felt like I personally had to relearn some things because care recommendations have changed so much over the years. I figured while I talk, I'd feature the large seahorses that we have now. I had them in a little bit smaller of a tank, and even though they were doing okay in there, I did feel like I had to move them to a bigger tank. I ordered them as something called a subspecies of the erectus, a northern version, and they were listed as arriving at 2.5 to 3.5 inches and maxing out at 4 inches. So in my mind, I'm thinking about, for example, let me see if I can get my fingers in here. If you have the dwarves at 1.5 to 2 inches as they're listed, which must be from head or snout to tail, I'm envisioning a seahorse that's maybe 2, possibly 3 times bigger. Well, when these seahorses arrived, they were much bigger than I anticipated, and so I knew I was going to have to offer an environment for them that was much closer to the requirements of the larger species who get to 7 inches or more. So I did have to invest some money, and if you haven't figured out by now, if you're going to get into marine fish, especially seahorses, be prepared to cough up some dollars because it's definitely not cheap. So I did keep my eyes open for a used aquarium that was larger. And believe it or not, I was shocked. Maybe this is the time I'm recording. We're still coming out of the pandemic, if you're familiar with the pandemic. Prices of the aquariums, to me, were just ridiculous for used. And I just happened to look online at one of the local fish store chains, and they were having a special. It was 50% off on their larger aquariums, and there was just no way I could compete with that. So I did invest in the larger aquarium and the lid for that. And then this soon turned into a family project. My daughter-in-law, who also loves the seahorses, she and my son came over, and them, along with my husband, we each took a role into preparing for the larger tank. So before we even started working with the larger tank, my husband was looking for a used aquarium, and he did get one for pretty inexpensive online, sold secondhand. He painted it of metal. I'm tapping it so you can hear. And then he got some boards to throw over the top and the bottom to create solid shelving. He had stained those and prepared them so they would be water resistant. And like I said, the tank itself was new, definitely bigger. And the top, the canopy, is new because I needed something that was going to fit. And the only other thing that was newer was the static cling bottom that I have underneath the tank and the background that I have there. So once the stand was ready, my daughter-in-law helped me clean out the aquarium, and she said this would have been such a great project to record and put the pieces together into video, and I agreed with her after we were all done. In total, it took us a few hours to get all of the work done. But we cleaned the new aquarium because it was brand new, and I just used sea salt, a little bit of sea salt, I don't measure it out. I just grabbed maybe less than a handful, put it in there, and I used a nylon scrubber and rinsed it out with a hose. We were in the backyard. The weather was nice that we could do that. And we rinsed it out that way, used the hose to rinse it, and then after that we made sure that the bottom and sides were wet down so we could adhere the static cling. So she helped me hold the decorating static cling backgrounds and bottom underneath and on the back of the aquarium so I could cut them to the correct size, and together we worked on sticking them the best that we could. I like the static cling versions of backgrounds because they don't require any tape or glue, and if you want to take them off, remove them, reposition them, replace them, it's really easy to do. The only disadvantage is it's nearly impossible to get the bubbles out. So those dark spots that you see both on the back of the tank and the bottom are just bubbles. But you know what, I don't find that really detracts from the attractiveness of the tank, and I do like the color that it turned out to be with the blue in there. Everything else that you see here I already had, and if you've watched all the other videos, I basically just transferred everything. So the canister filter that I was using on the previous smaller tank, it was really nice to just be able to move that over, and of course it was already seeded. Good biological colonizing bacteria is already in there, so there really wasn't a problem switching this over. I used just about all the water from the smaller tank and had seawater prepared to add. I still have my protein skimmer draining down below, but I found a container that looks a little bit more decorative, and when that fills up or starts to accumulate, then I just dump out the whole thing, and the hose fits in there very nicely. I'm using the exact same protein skimmer. I've had this for years and years. I'm trying to remember what it's called. I think it's something like C. Remora or something like that. They don't make them anymore. It's an Italian design, a special injection built into the design, and it came with this cobalt power head, also an Italian design. That's not made anymore either. You can't buy these anymore. I think I bought these many years ago on sale. It was still pretty expensive for back in the day, especially for my budget back in those days, but just reading the description of how effective it was worth the investment, and I just kept it all these years, and now I'm really glad that I did. The thing that's nice about this with the larger seahorses, it's recommended that the filtration and skimming systems that you have are actually overrated for the size tank that you're using. This is a 29-gallon aquarium. The filter that I have on here is rated for up to 45 gallons, so that is definitely overrated. The skimmer here is rated for up to 75 gallons. I'm using the same light that I have, which I really like because it has built-in timing and settings to simulate sunrise and slowly increases light intensity through the day and then starts to simulate sunset by decreasing the amount of light. But you may recognize that I have the same sea fan that was brought in here, the same plant that we drilled into what is actually a plastic piece. It looks like a real shell, but it's a piece of plastic, so it's a little bit lighter than an actual seashell. And one of the reasons why we have stones loaded in the back to give it some weight so it doesn't float off. But in this larger tank, with the way the tank is flowing, I also had to leverage or wedge the back of that shell decoration. I don't know if you can see it. There you go. There's a little stone underneath, and that's just wedging it up, propping up, so it keeps the front of it down. And there's a tiny bit of food in the shell now. And the seahorses, I've had them a few weeks now. They've learned very well that this is the feeding spot. I use a feeding tube just like I showed in a previous video. And basically I let the food go down what was designed to be an aquarium airlift tube. The seahorses watch the frozen shrimp go down the tube and land in their dish. And when they're hungry, they know their dish is where they need to go. This is a wonderful setup. If you can train your seahorses to eat from a single spot or a seahorse feeding station, it really helps with the cleanup. I mentioned before I purposely don't use any substrate in the tank. You'd be surprised how much you can pick up, how much detritus that you can get building up even in a bare bottom tank. And even with the few decorations or hitching posts that I have here, just moving those around, you can see things that build up. So I'm probably, when I'm doing a water change, going to take each of these items out and clean them. I have some toothbrushes that I use specifically for the aquarium, so it might be good to do that for here. But you can see overall the tank looks really clean. So I do have a regimen similar to what I did with the dwarf seahorses. I use a rigid airline tuning and just kind of do a quick 1 or 2 minute vacuum each evening to get up anything that is obviously accumulating. I get the bottom of the aquarium, wherever I see anything hanging that looks like it needs to be cleaned up. I even put it on the sponges. I have sponges as on the intakes. Oh, I see I have to move that sponge up there. Sponges on the intakes of the filter and on the power head. And I don't really need to have them there. They do add a little bit of biological filtration, but the reason I have them there is if and when the day comes that my seahorse pair decides to mate and babies are born, it will prevent them from getting soaked up. Oh, that's Pearl, the female, and like I said, the seahorses know this is where they go when they get hungry and they want to eat. So I just thought I would zoom in on her and you could watch her chow down while I'm talking. One other thing that I did do that is a little bit different than how I had the other setup, I noticed that the surface of the aquarium did not have as much agitation as it should, and films were building up, probably from the oils from the shrimp. Even though I was good about cleaning up the shrimp and making sure that it wasn't collecting and decaying in the tank, I needed to make sure that the surface was agitated better. So you may remember that I bought these little tiny sponge filters. Originally they were for the dwarf seahorse tanks and were perfect for that, but now they work great as an agitator to the surface, and it's working out fantastically. So I'm feeling really good about this setup. For the first time, I really looked at some different water parameters beyond the basics. Typically, I would, in a transition period, check for nitrites. Nitrates are something that should be checked fairly often because I have this larger tank. I can do that with my weekly water changes, and I'll probably change around 10%. I'll probably do a video showing the steps I take to do a water change for this tank as well. Let's see, I was talking about the measurements, apologize. So I measured things that I don't typically measure just because I was curious, and I saw recommendations for the range to keep for these seahorses. And so I've tested things like magnesium, water hardness, phosphates, in addition to the nitrates and for the pH. And everything is looking really good. I think the canister filter I'm using is working really good. I do have one chemical resin nitrate reducer in there, a small quantity, And since that seems to be working for me, I think I'm going to continue with that and just make sure that it gets changed as needed whenever I clean out the canister filter. So that gives you a little bit of an explanation of why we went to larger Seahorses, and my needing to move to a larger tank. Because these Seahorses are actually smaller than the subspecies of Southern Erectus, I might be able to fit in another Seahorse or two, possibly even three. The parameters in the water look really good right now, so that will be my guide. If I start adding and noticing a change, that will be a signal to me that I have to be careful. But right now I'm going to let this run with the two Seahorses, and I'll continue filming their antics, and if there's any updates with them, flirting behavior, any young being born, and things like that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for tuning in. I really appreciate your following my Seahorse journey with me. I'm learning a lot and relearning a lot. I had a lot of useful knowledge from my past experience, but of course things continue to evolve, and as all of us should do, we try to get better and better. So thanks so much for joining me. It's always great to be with you. Take care.